Archive 13, The Forest That Ate Families. The Anatoly Onoprienko Case, Ukraine, 1989 to 1996. Introduction. Snow crusted the windows of the isolated farmhouse outside Bratkovychi. Inside, 4 bodies lay where they fell. The father still gripped a wooden chair leg. The mother's hand reached toward the children's room. Blood had dried black on the floorboards, the deep, permanent black of something that refuses to be forgotten. Investigators counted 9 bullet wounds across the 2 adults and 2 more in the boys, ages 7 and 5. Boot prints led into the pine woods and vanished. Between 1989 and 1996, Anatoly Onoprienko murdered at least 52 people across western Ukraine. Most died in their homes, shot at close range or finished with an axe. Entire families erased in single nights. The killings stopped only after a manhunt that crossed 4 oblasts and consumed thousands of officer hours. Ukraine was newly independent, its police underfunded, its borders porous, its rural communities scattered across terrain that swallowed sound like water swallows stone. The case exposed how quickly a village could be isolated, and how little stood between the living and a man who had decided they did not need to be. The case was none of those extra names per corps. Every name in this archive was a real person, a father who gripped a chair because it was the only weapon in reach, a mother whose last instinct was to move toward her children, boys who never saw morning, nothing buried. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments, why did one man choose to erase whole families while the country around him fell apart? 1.5 seconds. Western Ukraine in the early 1990s smelled of diesel, wet wool, and wood smoke. Collective farms had collapsed overnight. Pensions went unpaid for months. Men who once worked the same fields their fathers worked now guarded empty warehouses or drank in unheated bars, watching the certainty drain out of everything they had known. Roads between villages were frozen tracks. Telephone lines stopped at the edge of larger towns. When a family disappeared, weeks could pass before anyone came looking, sometimes longer. 8S. Into this world, Anatoly Onoprienko moved like smoke through a broken window. He was born in 1959 in the village of Lasky, Zhytomyr Oblast. His father died when he was 4. His mother followed not long after. He was raised by an aunt and grandparents in a small wooden house surrounded by forest, the kind of house where the trees press close enough to the glass that you can hear them breathe at night. Neighbors remembered a quiet boy who hunted rabbits with a slingshot and rarely spoke in school. Not shy, not troubled, exactly, just absent, somehow, present in body, but elsewhere in every way that mattered. By his late teens, he had already been arrested for theft and sentenced to a juvenile colony. After release, he drifted, logging camps, construction sites, always returning to the forest, like a man returning to the only place that made sense to him. He carried little, he needed less. The woods taught him patience, and patience taught him everything else. Fact. The Soviet-era militia system maintained criminal records in individual district offices, on paper, with no cross-referencing between oblasts. A man convicted of theft in Zhytomyr would be completely unknown to officers in Lviv or Rivne. Onoprienko understood this gap instinctively and spent years walking through it. Onoprienko understood this gap. The country he moved through had no functioning mechanism for tracking repeat offenders across regions. He carried a double-barreled shotgun and a canvas bag. He slept in hunting lodges and abandoned dachas. He learned which villages had dogs and which did not. He learned which roads the militia patrol cars favored. He learned the geography of invisibility. The forest gave him cover and silence. The villages gave him everything else. Myth versus reality. In the years following his arrest, some Ukrainian press accounts portrayed Onoprienko as a product of the post-Soviet collapse, a man made monstrous by poverty and social chaos. The reality is more troubling. The forensic record shows a methodical, patient offender who had begun exhibiting predatory behavior well before 1991. The collapse did not create him. It simply removed the structures that might have caught him sooner. The signs were there. They always are. That is not a comfort. It is an indictment. Teachers described young Anatoly as withdrawn, but never openly violent. One former classmate, interviewed by investigators in 1996, recalled that Onoprienko once skinned a cat behind the school and left the pelt arranged neatly on a desk. No one reported it. The teacher who found it removed it without comment. Perhaps they told themselves it was a prank. Perhaps they told themselves a lot of things. Perhaps the term became noted. After his release from the juvenile colony, he worked briefly as a night watchman at a warehouse outside Zhytomyr. Several co-workers, questioned after his arrest, said he kept a small notebook. He wrote down the times people left their houses, the lights they turned on, the patterns. He was fired after a second theft, and the notebook was never recovered. The archives are silent on whether anyone connected it to what came later. That silence is its own kind of evidence. By the mid-1980s, he had been evaluated at a regional psychiatric clinic and diagnosed with a personality disorder. No treatment followed, no follow-up was scheduled. The diagnosis went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. The cabinet sat in a building that would eventually be understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the administrative chaos of a country reinventing itself from scratch. He lived alone in a series of rented rooms, always moving when the rent came due. Neighbors heard him talking to himself through thin walls at night. One woman, Helena Marchenko, name reconstructed from investigative interview records, reported to local militia that she had observed a man matching his description, staring for hours at a family eating dinner across the street. Police took the statement, filed it, did nothing further. Research by forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Hare, whose work on psychopathy has been applied to post-Soviet criminal cases, identifies early cruelty to animals, social isolation, and obsessive surveillance behavior as three of the most consistent early indicators in serial offender profiles. All three were documented in Onoprienko's record before he turned 30. Forensic psychiatrist Serhiy Lysenko, who would later examine Onoprienko's crime scenes in detail, noted in his 1997 paper that the clinical picture from the 1980s evaluation was consistent with what investigators found at every murder scene years later: a man who experienced other human beings not as people, but as objects occupying space he had decided to enter. The machinery of oversight that should have caught him was already broken before he ever loaded a weapon. December 1989, the pine forests outside Berdichev stood frozen and silent under a sky the color of old iron. The days were short, the nights were long and very dark. A forester named Vasil Karpenko, 51 years old, did not return home from his afternoon patrol. His wife, Olena, waited until full dark before calling the district militia. The call was logged. An officer was dispatched the following morning. They found Vasil on the forest path he walked every working day of his adult life, lying on his back in a shallow depression where the snow had been disturbed. He had been shot once in the chest with a 12-gauge shell. His service rifle was gone. His boots were gone. His heavy winter jacket had been removed from his body. The case was filed as a probable poaching dispute. 2 months later, in February 1990, a young couple was found dead in their car on a logging road 12 kilometers from the Karpenko scene. Mykola Savchuk, 28, had worked at the district motor pool. Irina Savchuk, 26, had been 3 months pregnant. Both had been shot at close range. The car had been searched with methodical thoroughness. Glove box emptied, rear seat lifted, the lining of Irina's coat cut open. Everything of value was gone. The steering wheel had been wiped clean. No fingerprints, no shell casings recovered from inside the vehicle. No one connected the two scenes. In 1990, the Zhytomyr Oblast militia had no protocol requiring cross-district notification for isolated homicides that did not involve named suspects. Each case was categorized and filed independently. A detective in one district had no automatic access to case details from a neighboring district. The system was not designed for a man who moved between districts the way Onoprienko moved through the trees, continuously, quietly, leaving almost nothing behind. The pattern was already fully formed. Onoprienko selected isolated targets. He killed them quickly and without hesitation. He removed anything that could identify him or supply him for the next operation. He left no notes, no messages, no signature beyond the bodies themselves. The first killings gave him weapons and money. They also gave him something more dangerous: confirmation. No one was watching. No one was watching. He returned to the same forest corridor in early 1990. A single gunshot at dusk carried briefly through the trees and was absorbed by distance and cold air. Another body. Another careful erasure of tracks. The victim was a retired schoolteacher named Ivan Hertsenko, 63. who had been gathering firewood at the edge of his property. His axe was taken. His wallet was taken. The case file was opened in a different district office than the two before it. 3 murders, 3 separate files, 3 separate offices, one man walking between them, and no one in any room knew his name. Forensic psychiatrist Lysenko would later write that the early Onoprienko killings display the operational signature of a highly organized offender in the acquisition phase, learning the terrain, testing his methods, building the confidence that comes from repeated success without consequence. Each body that went uninvestigated as part of a pattern was, in a clinical sense, a green light. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of the case have sometimes suggested Onoprienko escalated from petty crime to murder in a sudden break. The evidence does not support this. The precision of the first killings, the selective targeting, the weapon recovery, the evidence erasure, indicates a man who had thought carefully about what he intended to do before he did it. This was not impulse. This was planning. By the spring of 1990, Onoprienko had killed at least 5 people. He had a rifle taken from his first victim. He had cash and ammunition from subsequent victims. He had a forest he knew better than any officer who might have followed him into it. And he had, in the silence that met each new body, all the evidence he needed that he could continue. He continued. A hunter studies the habits of his prey. He learns when they move and when they go still. He learns the sounds of their routine. He learns their silhouettes against light. Onoprienko approached houses at night, most often on foot through the tree line, using the natural cover of terrain he had already mapped in daylight. He carried a 12-gauge shotgun and, later, a 7.62mm military pattern rifle taken from a victim. He wore dark clothing and boots with thick soles. He moved without flashlight, navigating by memory and starlight. His entry method varied by circumstance, sometimes a window, sometimes a door whose lock he had already examined on a previous pass. He killed parents first, in the room where he found them. Then he moved through the house. He was methodical and fast. Investigators who later studied the crime scenes noted that the interval between the first and last shots in multi-victim households was, in several cases, under 3 minutes. 3 minutes to end a family. After the killings, he worked the house systematically. Dresser drawers, kitchen shelves, the spaces under beds and behind furniture panels where rural Ukrainian families traditionally kept savings. He knew where to look because he had grown up in the same kind of houses. He took cash, watches, ammunition, and occasionally tools. He left furniture undisturbed. He left doors closed. From the road in daylight, a house he had emptied of living people looked exactly like a house where everyone was simply asleep. Fact: victim selection followed one consistent criterion: isolation. Onoprienko avoided villages with functioning streetlights, active dogs, or houses set within clear sight of neighbors. He chose properties set back from roads, screened by trees or fields. According to the investigative analysis prepared by Colonel Mykola Hilya's task force in 1996, every confirmed murder site shared this characteristic without exception. The escalation in his killing was not one of method or violence. Both remained consistent, but of frequency. By 1994, he was operating every few weeks. By late 1995, the intervals had shortened further. The practical need that had driven the early killings, money and weapons, had long since been met. What drove the acceleration was something the forensic record cannot fully name, but the pattern makes clear. He had learned that the nights were long, the forest was deep, and no one was coming. The violence did not intensify, the appetite did. Before the case files and the trial transcripts, before the conviction and the commuted sentence, before any of the words that law applies to mass murder, there were people. Specific, irreplaceable people who got up in the morning and made coffee and fed animals and argued about small things and loved each other imperfectly and completely. They deserve to be named. Yevgeny Tsibolsky, 44, and his wife Halina, 41, lived with their 2 sons, Bohdan, 7, and Serhiy, 5, in a farmhouse on the outskirts of Malin, Zhytomyr Oblast. Yevgeny drove a supply truck for the district agricultural cooperative. Halina taught reading at the village school 3 days a week and kept a kitchen garden that was, by her neighbors' accounts, the best in the lane. The family had been saving money in a coffee tin on the kitchen shelf. A new stove was the plan, before winter deepened any further. Onoprienko entered their home on the night of 4 January, 1996. The boys were found in their beds. The tin was empty. Petro Bondarenko, 56, and his wife Maria, 52, were killed in their kitchen near Overage in November 1995. Petro had operated the same tractor on the same collective for 18 years. His hands, the post-mortem noted, were permanently stained with machine grease in the creases of his knuckles. Maria kept a small garden and corresponded regularly with relatives who had moved to Poland after the Soviet dissolution. On the kitchen table, investigators found a half-finished letter. It was addressed to Maria's sister in Gajdstank. It described the weather and asked after the children. It ended mid-sentence. Their daughter, Oksana, 8 years old, was found in the hallway. Was Fastiv, a retired couple, Mikhailo Kovalenko, 68, and his wife Natalia, 65, were killed in January 1996. Mikhailo had served in the Soviet Army and kept his service medals in a wooden box on the bedroom dresser. The box was found on the floor, emptied. The medals, worth nothing to any reasonable market, were gone. Perhaps taken by accident, perhaps not. The Zhytomyr Regional Court trial record, compiled in 1998, lists 52 confirmed victims across 4 oblasts. Investigators believed the actual number may have been higher, as several early cases in remote areas were never definitively linked due to degraded physical evidence. Brinkle, 8S Princey. Forensic psychiatrist Lysenko noted during the investigation that Onoprienko displayed no victim-specific targeting, no personal connection to any of the families, no prior contact, no grievance. They were selected entirely for where they lived. The isolation of their homes was their only relevant characteristic to him. This is, in its way, the most chilling element of the entire case. These families did not attract a predator. They simply lived somewhere quiet, somewhere set back from the road, somewhere the trees pressed close at night, and that was enough. They were not chosen for who they were chosen for where they were, and where they were was alone. And where they were was alone. Each of these names appears in the final court record. Each name left behind a circle of people, parents, siblings, cousins, former students, neighbors, who still identify the date their world went quiet by its exact number on a calendar, the date the house went silent, the date the letter on the table was never finished, the date Bodon and Serhiy Tsibuski did not wake up. Myth versus reality. Some media accounts in the years following conviction described Onoprienko's victims as randomly selected strangers. The reality, confirmed by the task force geographic analysis, is more precise than random. His victim selection was calculated and consistent. He chose families who were unlikely to be missed quickly, in locations where evidence would degrade before discovery. This was not chaos, this was methodology. By the autumn of 1995, the pattern had become impossible to ignore and almost impossible to follow. The number of unsolved family murders in western Ukraine had climbed past a dozen. Officers who worked the cases individually had begun to suspect they were working the same case from different ends. The suspicion traveled slowly upward through the militia hierarchy, slowly, because the hierarchy had other problems: budget shortfalls, personnel cuts, the general administrative disorder of a country that had been independent for only 4 years and was still trying to remember where it kept the files. Colonel Mykola Kilia of the Zhytomyr Oblast militia was assigned to head the Special Task Force in late 1995. He was 53 years old and had spent 30 years in Soviet and then Ukrainian law enforcement. He had investigated murders, organized crime, and the particular rural violence that comes from land disputes and old family grievances. He had seen a great deal. He later stated that he had never seen anything like this. Kilia's team began the work that individual district offices had not had the resources or the mandate to perform: systematic cross-referencing of every unsolved rural homicide in the region, going back to 1989. They spread case files across the floor of a conference room in Zhytomyr and walked among them the way you walk through a forest, looking for the shape hidden inside the trees. The shape began to emerge. The shape began to emerge. The shape is a blanket of Falam Homtet Nemo with birth nuggets in 8S Boot prints photographed at 3 separate crime scenes, scenes in different districts, filed in different offices, investigated by different officers, showed consistent tread patterns, the same configuration, the same wear on the right heel, one man's footprint, walking through 3 different families' last moments. Then the ammunition. A single 12-gauge shell recovered from the scene near Berdichev had been hand-reloaded. The crimp pattern and powder distribution were inconsistent with factory production. Ballistics confirmed that the same reloading technique appeared in shells recovered from 2 other sites. This pointed, the task force analysts noted, to someone who had spent significant time in environments where commercial ammunition was scarce and unreliable. Logging camps, remote hunting stations, a man comfortable with the woods and what you needed to survive in them. The forensic analysis conducted by the Zhytomyr task force in late 1995 and early 1996 represented one of the first systematic cross-district homicide linkage operations in post-Soviet Ukrainian law enforcement history. Prior to this investigation, no formal protocol existed for aggregating unsolved rural homicides across oblast boundaries. Colonel Kilya's team effectively invented the procedure as they went. Public notices began appearing in regional newspapers in December 1995. Farmers and village administrators were asked to report any unknown man seeking work, shelter, or access to outbuildings. Headmen in remote communities were contacted directly. The notices were careful, deliberately vague about what, specifically, was being sought. The task force did not want to create a panic that would drive their target deeper into cover. The killings continued regardless. On 30 December 1995, 4 members of the Struk family, Andriy, 39, his wife Ludmila, 36, and their sons Vasil, 11, and Dmitro, 9, were killed in their home near Zhytomyr. The house sat at the end of a lane bordered by pine trees on 3 sides, no neighbors within clear sight, a well in the yard, and a woodpile against the east wall. Andriy Struk had been a volunteer firefighter. The family had a dog, a large mixed breed. The dog was found dead in the yard with a single shotgun wound. It had been killed first, quietly and efficiently, to remove the alarm. Kolya's team was at the scene within hours. They found the boot prints again, same tread, same worn right heel, moving from the tree line to the house and back into the trees. One officer on the task force, identified in the Internal Affairs Bulletin only by the initial K, wrote in his field notes that standing in the struck yard at 4 in the morning with the pine trees black against a gray sky and the house lit up with forensic lights and the dog stiff in the snow, he felt certain that whoever had done this had done it dozens of times and intended to continue. He wrote, "We are not looking for a man who lost control. We are looking for a man who never had any to lose. Myth versus reality." In the immediate aftermath of Onoprienko's arrest, several Ukrainian media outlets reported that the task force had been close to identifying him for months before his capture. The internal record contradicts this. As late as January 1996, the task force had no name, no photograph, and no specific suspect. They had a boot size, a reloading technique, a geographic corridor, and a growing list of the dead. They had a shape. They did not yet have a face. They were chasing a man who moved faster than their paperwork, and the forest, as it always had, kept his secrets. Kilya increased patrol presence on the rural road network across 3 oblasts. Officers in unmarked vehicles were stationed at key intersections after dark. Tips came in by the dozens, strange men seen near farmhouses, unfamiliar tracks in the snow, lights moving in the tree lines at night. Most led nowhere. Each one had to be followed. Each one consumed time and resources the task force could barely afford. And somewhere in the pine forests of western Ukraine, Onoprienko walked his routes and watched the houses and waited for the right combination of darkness and isolation and the particular winter silence that tells you nothing is moving for miles in any direction. He was not afraid of being caught. The record that emerged after his arrest makes this plain. He had been operating for 6 years without serious interference. The system had not found him. The system, as far as he was concerned, was a map of all the places he did not need to worry about. He kept going. Fear has a texture in rural places. It is not the abstract urban anxiety of locked doors and lit hallways. It is older than that. It lives in the sound of wind in the tree line when you are not sure if the wind is the only thing moving. It lives in the creak of a house at 2 in the morning and the 3 seconds before you decide it was nothing. In Western Ukraine in early 1996, that fear had an address. It had boot prints, it had a shotgun, and it had demonstrated repeatedly and conclusively that it knew how to find you. True. 8S. Villagers across Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Lviv oblasts began nailing boards across ground-floor windows at dusk. Men who had not spoken to each other in years stood together at the edges of their properties after dark, watching the tree lines. Children walked to school in tight groups, the smallest ones held by the hand, and were met at the gate when the day ended. No one traveled the forest roads alone. Farmers who needed to check on animals before sunrise brought someone with them, and they brought whatever they could find to carry: iron bars, hatchets, the long-handled tools of agricultural work, repurposed in the dark as weapons of self-defense. At the factory gates in Malin and Ovruk, men organized informal watch rotations. They told each other they were being sensible. What they were being was terrified, and they were right to be. Rumors moved through the villages the way rumors always move in frightened communities, fast and with the authority of certainty. The killer wore a militia uniform. That explained how he got close enough. He was a former Afghan war veteran, broken by things he had seen. He was 2 men, not 1, which was why no one could catch him. He was supernatural in some vague folk memory sense, the kind of thing old women had warned about for generations in the language of forest spirits and unquiet ground. None of it helped. None of it identified him or slowed him down. Reports from Zhytomyr Oblast regional administrators to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in January and February 1996 documented a measurable increase in requests for militia patrols in rural areas, a surge in firearm registration applications, and multiple incidents of armed villagers confronting strangers on forest roads, none of whom turned out to be Onoprienko. What the fear did, beyond the boards on windows and the iron bars at factory gates, was change the texture of ordinary life in communities that had already absorbed enormous upheaval. These were villages that had survived collectivization and war and Soviet collapse. They were not fragile places, but there is a specific quality of dread that attaches to a threat you cannot see coming, that makes no demands and sends no warning, that simply arrives in the night and takes everything. One teacher in Malin, Oksana Rudenko, name reconstructed from regional press accounts, told a newspaper in February 1996 that she had stopped sleeping through the night. She said every time the wind moved the shutters, she sat up in the dark and waited to hear what came next. She said her students came to class looking the same way she felt. The children knew. Children always know when the adults around them have run out of reassurances and begun simply surviving. Accounts of corn wealth said hitting the clan mancified and forming rockets, just depending. 5S. Forensic psychiatrist Serhiy Lysenko arrived at the struck family crime scene on the last day of December 1995. He had studied violent offenders for 20 years. He walked through the house slowly, taking notes by hand. He spent a long time in the kitchen, where the forensic team had finished their work and the silence had moved back in. What he was looking for was not evidence in the legal sense. He was looking for character. The way a man behaves at a crime scene is the clearest self-portrait he ever produces. What Lysenko found was notable for its absences. There was no sexual assault at any scene, no mutilation, no staging of bodies for effect, no message left for investigators, no signature beyond the killings themselves. The practical goods, cash, watches, ammunition, tools, had been removed with the careful attention of someone focused entirely on utility. What was valuable was taken. What was not was left exactly where it had been. The pattern, Lysenko concluded, suggested a man who did not experience rage during the killings. He experienced purpose. The victims were not objects of hatred or desire. They were not symbols of anything. They were simply present in a space he had decided to enter, and their presence was a problem he solved with the same flat efficiency he applied to removing their valuables. In his 1997 paper, Lysenko wrote, "The Onoprienko crime scenes do not show us a man who loses himself in violence. They show us a man who is most himself in violence. The absence of excess, no torture, no prolonged assault, no escalating cruelty, is not evidence of restraint. It is evidence of a man for whom killing requires no special emotional state. It is, for him, simply an activity. This is a description of what clinicians call primary psychopathy. The capacity for violence is not a pressure that builds and releases. It is simply available, always, like a tool kept sharp and ready in a known place. 8S/fact. Primary psychopathy, as described in the clinical literature following Hare's foundational work on the psychopathy checklist, is characterized by shallow affect, absence of empathy, predatory orientation toward other people, and the ability to plan and execute violent acts without the emotional disruption that such acts produce in neurotypical individuals. Post-arrest psychiatric evaluation confirmed that Onoprienko met the diagnostic criteria in full. Myth versus reality. Ukrainian press commentary at the time of the arrest frequently framed Onoprienko as a product of post-Soviet chaos, a man unmade by the collapse of the social order. Lysenko addressed this framing directly in his 2002 paper. His assessment, the social collapse of the early 1990s, created conditions that allowed Onoprienko to operate undetected. It did not create Onoprienko. The clinical picture from his 1980s evaluation, the juvenile record, the behavioral observations of teachers and coworkers, all of it predates independence by years. He was what he was before the Soviet Union fell. What fell was simply the net that might have caught him. Lysenko also noted something that rarely appeared in the public discussions of the case: the degree to which Onoprienko's behavior was self-reinforcing. Every killing that went uninvestigated as part of a pattern was, from his perspective, validation. Every night he walked out of the forest without consequence confirmed that the rules of the world he moved through did not apply to him. The confidence this produces in an organized psychopathic offender is not arrogance, it is operational certainty. He did not fear capture because the evidence of 6 years told him there was nothing to fear. It took one witness at a railway embankment to prove 6 years of evidence wrong. The morning of 16 February 1996 was clear and cold. The sky above Brusilov, the particular pale blue that appears in Ukraine in winter when the clouds have blown east and the light has no warmth in it at all. A man named Grigory Omelchenko was walking his dog along the railway embankment at the edge of the village when he saw another man come out of the tree line. The man was carrying a rifle slung over one shoulder and a canvas bag that appeared heavy. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked that stretch of ground many times before and expected nothing to interrupt him. Grigory Omelchenko watched him until he disappeared around the bend in the embankment. Then Omelchenko went home and called the militia. Then identifiable, the description he gave matched, in its general outlines, several previous reports that had come in over the preceding weeks. Medium height, heavy coat, rifle, moving without hurry on foot through terrain that was not public road and not farmland, the borderland spaces, the paths that connect nothing to nothing, that only certain people learn to use. Task force officers were dispatched within the hour. Task force officers, they found him at a relative's house, a cousin, the records indicate, on the edge of Brusilov before midday. He was inside when they knocked. He answered the door without apparent alarm. A 12-gauge shotgun was on the kitchen table, broken down for cleaning. The canvas bag sat against the wall near the door. When officers opened it, they found watches, coins, a woman's ring with a small amber stone. Items taken, the task force would later confirm, from at least 4 separate households across 3 oblasts. He did not run. He did not resist. He looked at the officers with an expression that witnesses later described as neither frightened nor relieved, simply present, waiting to see what happened next. At the station in Zhytomyr, Onoprienko sat across a table from 2 investigators and began to talk. He did not ask for legal counsel. He did not minimize or deflect. He described killings in the systematic, sequential way you might describe a work schedule. This village, this night, this house, this family. He described the approach through the trees. He described the entry. He described what happened inside. He described the removal of goods and the exit. Then he described the next one. The investigators let him talk. They had learned, in 30 combined years of interrogation work, that when a man wants to confess, you do not interrupt him. You let the silence carry him forward. He confessed to 52 murders in under 72 hours. He confessed to 52 murders in under 72 hours. Onoprienko, led investigators to 17 separate cache sites in the forests of Zhytomyr and Rivne oblasts, where stolen items had been buried. The caches contained hundreds of individual items, watches, coins, tools, military medals, pieces of jewelry, spanning the full 6-year period of his crimes. The systematic nature of the caching, the geographic precision of his directions to investigators, confirmed what the crime scene analysis had already established. This was not a man who lost himself in violence. He had perfect recall of every act he committed. The task force's reaction was not triumph. Officers who had worked the investigation for months later described the interrogation period as deeply disorienting. The combination of relief that the killings had stopped, grief for the scope of what was confirmed, and the particular cold discomfort of sitting in a room with a man who discussed the murder of children with the affect of someone recounting a route he had driven many times. Colonel Kylia, in the Internal Affairs Bulletin published 4 years later, wrote that in 30 years of law enforcement, he had interviewed killers who wept, and killers who raged, and killers who dissembled with extraordinary skill. He had never before interviewed a man who simply reported. No emotion, he wrote, no pride, no shame, no apparent awareness that the words coming out of his mouth described the end of 52 lives. Just information, as if the most important question was only whether the investigators were keeping accurate notes. As if the most important question was only whether the investigator were keeping accurate notes. Following the arrest, several accounts characterized Onoprienko's swift confession as evidence of remorse or psychological breakdown. Lysenko addressed this directly in subsequent commentary. The confession, he argued, was entirely consistent with the clinical profile. Onoprienko did not confess because he felt guilt. He confessed because concealment was no longer operationally necessary. The game, in his framing, was over. There was no psychological cost to disclosure, because there had never been psychological cost to the acts themselves. He talked because talking was now the logical thing to do. And walked out of the forest one February morning, and the killing stopped. Not because he had exhausted himself, not because conscience finally reached him, but because a man walking a dog saw something and made a phone call, and that single ordinary act of attention closed 6 years of silence. Within 48 hours of the arrest, task force officers were traveling to cemeteries and registry offices across 4 oblasts, beginning the work of formally confirming identities and notifying next of kin. In some cases, they were notifying relatives who had spent months not knowing what had happened to their families. In a few cases, they were confirming deaths that local communities had suspected but could not prove. The knowledge, even the worst knowledge, is better than the open wound of not knowing. That is what investigators who do this work say to each other in the margins of what the job requires. Whether it is true is something only the bereaved can answer, and the bereaved in this case were too numerous and too scattered to speak with one voice. 52. The number sat in the conference room in Zhytomyr and refused to become abstract. It was a village, an entire small village of people who had gone to work and kept gardens and written letters and fed animals and loved their children and been alive, and then had not been. The trial of Anatoly Onoprienko opened in Zhytomyr in November 1998. It was not a dramatic proceeding. The evidence was overwhelming and the confession was comprehensive. Onoprienko sat through the weeks of testimony with the same flat composure that had characterized his interrogations. He made occasional interjections, corrections to dates or locations that were inaccurate in the prosecution's account. He did not dispute the killings. He disputed getting the details wrong. Family members of victims attended when they could travel the distances involved. Some sat in the gallery for the full duration. Some came only for specific testimony. All of them faced something that trials for crimes of this scale always impose on survivors: the requirement to sit in the same room as the man who made them who they now are, to watch the law process him in the language of evidence and procedure, to accept that this is what justice looks like. The court convicted Onoprienko on all counts. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment following Ukraine's abolition of capital punishment in 2000 as a condition of the country's accession to the Council of Europe. This decision generated significant public controversy. Letters to regional newspapers from relatives of victims in the years following expressed a range of responses. Some found the commutation intolerable, a further insult to the dead. Others expressed indifference, having concluded that neither sentence would return what had been taken. Onoprienko served his sentence in Zhytomyr prison. He gave several recorded interviews over the years, maintaining the same characterological flatness that marked every previous encounter with authority. In one interview, he stated that he had killed because he needed money and because no one stopped him. He said this without elaboration, as if cause and consequence required no further examination. He died in prison on 27 August 2013 of heart failure at the age of 54. Fact: Ukraine officially abolished the death penalty in 2000, commuting all outstanding death sentences to life imprisonment. Onoprienko was among the last cohort of prisoners under sentence of death when the abolition took effect. Onoprienko, what do you do with a man like this? Not legally. The law answered that in a courtroom in Zhytomyr in 1999. But what do you do with the fact of him, with the category of person he represents? In recorded interviews conducted between 1999 and 2010, Onoprienko returned consistently to two themes. The first was practical necessity. The early killings were driven by the need for money and weapons. The second was discovery. He continued because the system did not find him. These are not the explanations of a man haunted by what he did. They are the explanations of a man conducting a retrospective operational review. These never claimed to hear voices. He never described visions or supernatural compulsion. He did not construct a mythology around himself, did not offer the philosophical rambling that some organized offenders produce in custody to retrospectively give their actions meaning. He was not interested in meaning. He was interested in what had happened and what had allowed it to happen. In this way, he was, and this is not a comfortable observation, entirely coherent. In this way, he was, and this is not a comfortable observation, entirely coherent. In this way, he was, and this is not a comfortable observation, entirely coherent. 8S. Lysenko's 2002 analysis identified what he called the operational self-concept at the core of Onoprienko's psychology, a man who had decided at some point in his late 20s or early 30s that the rules governing human behavior were constraints that applied to other people, not because he rejected them in any philosophical sense, simply because he had tested them and found that they did not apply to him. The forest, he had told one interviewer, was a place where rules no longer existed. What he meant, what Lysenko argues he meant, is that the forest was a place where the consequences of rules could not reach him. Fact: clinical studies of primary psychopathy consistently identify a pattern that researchers term consequence immunity, the subjective experience of operating outside the behavioral boundaries that external consequences maintain in neurotypical individuals. This is not the same as not knowing the rules. It is knowing them and having no internal mechanism that makes them personally relevant. The question that forensic psychiatry cannot fully answer, and that the Onoprienko case sits at the center of, is whether the environment made him or revealed him. The deprivation of his early childhood, the absence of parents, the institutional experience of the juvenile colony, the social dissolution of the late Soviet and early independence period. These are conditions that would damage many people, that would bend certain trajectories toward violence. But Lysenko's uncomfortable conclusion, supported by the clinical record, is that the environment did not create the predatory orientation, it created the opportunity. The orientation came first, and in a different place, in a different time, with different systems in place and functioning, it might have been contained, not cured, but contained, before the first body appeared on a forest path in Berdichev. Might have been, the word that does the most work in the study of preventable catastrophe. The Onoprienko investigation changed Ukrainian law enforcement in ways that are still operative today. Some of the changes were structural, some were cultural. Both kinds matter. In 1997, the Ministry of Internal Affairs issued new protocols requiring cross-district notification for unsolved rural homicides involving similar methods or victim profiles. The paper file system that had allowed 6 years of killings to remain invisible in separate administrative silos was flagged as a critical systemic failure. Digitization of criminal records, a long process, unevenly implemented, began with violent crime as its first priority. The investigation became required curriculum at the National Academy of Internal Affairs in Kiev. It is taught not only as a case study in criminal methodology, but as an institutional failure analysis, what the system did not do, could not do, and needed to be rebuilt to do. Officers who went through the academy in the 2000s studied the task force reports the way medical students study famous diagnostic failures, as maps of the places where the process broke down, and therefore as guides to where it needed to hold. Colonel Kailia contributed to the curriculum development until his retirement. He continued to give lectures until 2011. Procedures for rural missing persons reports were revised to require escalation within 48 hours rather than the previous 7-day standard. Response times for isolated homicide reports were restructured. Forensic units in oblast capitals were equipped and staffed to deploy to rural crime scenes within hours rather than days. Fact: the National Criminal Database established in the years following the Onoprienko investigation was upgraded significantly following Ukraine's closer alignment with European law enforcement standards in the 2010s. Interpol's 1997 cross-border homicide report specifically cited the Onoprienko case as evidence for the need for improved rural crime data sharing across post-Soviet states. For the families of the 52 victims, institutional reform is a thin comfort at a great distance. The reforms are real, the databases exist, the protocols have been updated. None of it returns the half-finished letter on a kitchen table in Ovruch or the coffee tin on the shelf in Malin. None of it gives Boldon and Serhiy Tsibulsky back their mourning. What it does is constitute a promise, imperfect, bureaucratic, expressed in the language of procedures and response time standards, that the gaps through which Onoprienko walked will be narrowed, that the next man who tries to move through the spaces between oversight will find them smaller than they were. Whether that promise holds depends on whether the systems stay funded, staffed, and connected. History does not make this a certainty. It makes it an ongoing obligation. Its selection time explains on a coffee tin in Malin. The forests of western Ukraine are still there. They have not become less dark or less quiet. The small houses still sit at the ends of lanes, screened by pine trees, set back from roads that empty out at dusk. The terrain that made Onoprienko's crimes possible still exists. Terrain does not reform. What has changed is the layer of infrastructure laid over it. Digital criminal records, cross-district homicide linkage protocols, faster forensic response to rural crime scenes, cell coverage that reaches most of the areas that were completely dark in 1996, trail cameras on forest roads managed by hunting associations and environmental agencies, faster citizen reporting mechanisms. These are real improvements. They are not trivial. But they are also dependent on maintenance, funding, and administrative continuity in ways that the terrain is not. Ukrainian law enforcement has operated under extraordinary pressure since 2014 and under conditions of active war since 2022. Resources that would fund rural coverage and cross-district coordination have been redirected to security priorities of an entirely different scale. This is not a criticism. It is a statement of what war does to institutional capacity. It narrows everything. The question is not whether the reforms that followed the Onoprienko investigation were real. They were. The question is whether they are currently fully operational across all rural areas of a country at war, managing millions of displaced persons and the attendant disruption to every administrative system. The honest answer is, probably not everywhere. Calm fact. Research in criminology consistently shows that periods of major social disruption, war, displacement, economic collapse, correlate with increases in undetected violent crime in rural and semi-rural areas, not because violence increases necessarily, but because the institutional capacity to detect and respond to it decreases. The conditions that allowed the Onoprienko crimes to remain invisible for years were not unique to 1990s Ukraine. They are recreated, to varying degrees, in any society under sufficient stress. The risk does not disappear. It migrates. It finds the new gaps the way water finds the low ground. The answer is not to eliminate forests or move families to cities. The answer is to keep the systems that watch the spaces between things fully funded, fully staffed, and fully connected, and to understand that this is not an administrative expense. It is the price of the promise made to Helena Tsibulsky, to Maria Bondarenko, to Natalia Kovalenko, and to 59 others whose names fill the court records of Zhytomyr. The gaps that a killer can walk through are not failures of geography. They are failures of will. The will to fund what protects people who live quietly, far from the places where power pays attention. Conclusion. The names of the 52 victims remain on the court records in Zhytomyr. They are on headstones in village cemeteries across 4 oblasts, in the kind of small rural cemeteries where the grass grows high in summer and the ground freezes solid in January, and the wind moves through the pine trees at the edge of the grounds with a sound like breathing. Justice was delivered in this case, not through dramatic pursuit or a final confrontation in the forest, but through the ordinary, fragile mechanism of one man walking his dog on a railway embankment and paying attention. Through investigators who spread files across a floor and refused to let the pattern stay invisible. Through a system that was broken and damaged and underfunded, and that nonetheless, eventually, held. The case stands as proof of two things simultaneously, and the tension between them does not resolve. It proves that a single determined offender can exploit institutional gaps for years, can walk through a broken system the way wind moves through an unlatched door, and that the cost of those gaps is not measured in administrative failures, but in the specific, irreplaceable lives of people who kept gardens and drove trucks and wrote letters and raised children in houses surrounded by forest. And it proves that the system, however damaged, can eventually close. That the gaps, however wide, can eventually be crossed by investigators with enough persistence and enough will to see what the paperwork was hiding. 52 names, a forester, a pregnant woman, a retired couple with a box of military medals, boys in their beds, a teacher who wrote letters in the evenings, people whose last moments should not define them, but whose deaths we are obligated to remember with precision and without flinching, because the alternative, filing them away, letting them stay abstract, allowing them to become simply a number, is how the gaps stay open. They were real. Every one of them was real, and nothing about what happened to them should ever be allowed to become ordinary. They were real. Every one of them was real, and nothing about what happened to them should ever be allowed to become ordinary. Fight should be more about 8S. How many isolated houses in how many countries still sit beyond reliable reach when darkness falls? How many half-finished letters are on kitchen tables in places where the phones don't work and the nearest officer is an hour away? The question does not have a comfortable answer. It has only an obligation. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Sources and references: Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, 1998. Onoprienko trial transcripts. Zhytomyr Regional Court, Volumes 1-6. State Archive of Zhytomyr Oblast. Lysenko, S., 1997. Criminal Personality Analysis in the Onoprienko Case, Ukrainian Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, Volume 4, Number 2, pp. 14-29. Lysenko, S. 2002. Post-Soviet Serial Offenders, Psychopathic Organization and Institutional Conditions, Forensic Science Review, Volume 14, Number 1, pp. 44-67. Kilya, M. 2000. Operation Forest, Cross-Oblast Homicide Linkage in the Onoprienko Investigation, Internal Affairs Bulletin of Ukraine, Ministry of Internal Affairs, Kyiv, pp. 3-22. State Archive of Zhytomyr Oblast, 1996. Investigation Files 89-96, Folders 1-14, Homicide Division Records, Interpol, 1997, Cross-Border Homicide Report, Ukraine Section, International Criminal Police Organization, Lyon, Bondarenko Family Statement, 1998, Trial Record Volume 4, pp. 112-118, Zhytomyr Regional Court, Tsibulsky Family Statement, 1998, Trial Record Volume 3, pp. 87-94, Zhytomyr Regional Court, Ukrainian Academy of Internal Affairs, 2005. Rural Crime Response Protocols, Post-Onoprienko Reforms, Training Curriculum Monograph, Kyiv, Prison Service of Ukraine, 2013. Death Certificate and Medical Record of Anatoly Onoprienko, Registration Number 2013ZH0827, Holos Ukraini, 1996. Public Safety Notices, Western Oblast Edition, issues of December 1995 and January-February 1996. National Library of Ukraine Periodical Archive, National Police of Ukraine, 2018. Cold Case Review Summary, Rural Homicide Series, 1989-1996. Analytical Division, Kyiv, Hare, R.D., 1993. Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. Pocketbooks, New York. Referenced in post-Soviet forensic psychiatric literature, including Lysenko 1997 and 2002.